The market's in positive territory today, taking their cues from politics instead of the pandemic. The Dow up around 800 points. MSNBC host David Gura joins me now. And David, this is a bit of a refreshing change. The market's going back to their old ways a bit, even if just for a day, rallying after Bernie Sanders dropped out of the presidential race. Would you run us through the reasons why Wall Street liked that news?
Yeah, we saw a lot of that volatility ebb during trading today on Wall Street. Look, a lot of investors feel comfortable with what Joe Biden represents. They're familiar with what the economic policies were, what the regulatory policies were when Barack Obama was the president of the United States. We've all heard the rhetoric that Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, has used during his campaign. He was promising a sort of radical reinvention of the U.S. economy in a lot of ways. What this did today was essentially just remove a variable in the calculus that a lot of these investors are looking at when they look at the U.S. economy, taking Bernie Sanders out of the equation. We'll have to see here as these weeks and months go on how much of his platform is incorporated into the entire Democratic platform, as Joe Biden is now the presumptive nominee for the Democratic ticket. But again, that variable, that presumptive change to the way things could work here in the United States removed as he says that he's suspending his campaign, Allison.
David, the coronavirus, of course, not completely out of the equation today. Dr. Fauci saying earlier on Fox News that there could be a turnaround this week. And you saw a lot of the industries that have been pretty hard hit by the coronavirus having a little bit of a good day on the markets.
Yeah, broad gains today across all the sectors of the S&P. But you're right. There are a lot of investors who feel optimistic in light of what they've heard from advisors to the president, including Dr. Anthony Fauci, talking about how much hard work has been done flattening the curve here in the United States and cities across the United States, expressing some optimism that in some of these places, in some municipalities, maybe the worst days are behind us in terms of hospitalizations and deaths. That said, there are a lot of places that still had some sobering news today in terms of the count of deaths and hospitalizations. There are other models that show that there could still be a lot worse yet to come. My takeaway from what we've been hearing from the administration, from advisors to the president, medical and scientific advisors, is people have been doing what they're supposed to be doing. Their hope is that we continue doing what they have advised us to keep doing. And again, what we're seeing here are just investors trying to get their heads and their arms around the public health, around the science, trying to look for that curve to flatten, as we all are. And what investors say, economists say, is there will be no market economic or market change at a sort of seismic, big fundamental level until we see that public health curve start to flatten out.
David, the Fed published the minutes from its March meeting this afternoon. This was the Fed's first meeting after it dropped interest rates to basically zero. Anything interesting in particular in those minutes today? I know you and I are big Fed geeks, and we like to see what Jay Powell and the rest of the Reserve is saying about our economy.
Yes, we are part of an elite club. I think of those who look at these minutes when they come out. I mean, what's novel about these minutes in particular is they're from that meeting that happened over the course of a weekend. It was arranged in advance of a scheduled meeting that was ultimately canceled. Members of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors thought that the situation was so critical in terms of the economy and the markets that they should meet early and try to instill some confidence in the U.S. economy, the global economy as well. Is there anything new in these minutes? No, not really. From what we've heard from Jay Powell, the chairman of the Fed, and what we've heard from other Fed presidents is how dire the situation was. But it was remarkable looking at these. It's fairly long, several pages of minutes from that meeting, as they sort of tick through what the economic conditions were like, what the market conditions were like, how dire the situation was as they saw it then, and what made them decide back in early March here to implement some of the emergency actions that they did.
David, I appreciate that you refer to it there as an elite club, because that is not always the reaction that I get from my producers when I say, ooh, the Fed minutes are out. So thank you for joining me there. I get a lot of eye rolls when I get excited about the Fed. But David, one last question for you before you go. I know you've been watching oil very closely. It shot up towards the end of the day. We know oil prices have been under a lot of pressure. Why the spike today?
Couple things to look ahead to. Tomorrow, OPEC Plus, as they call it, OPEC Plus Russia, they're going to have a virtual meeting. Normally they meet in Vienna with a lot of pomp and circumstance. That's not going to happen. Of course, we're all meeting by Zoom or other means these days. But there is a conversation taking place about whether those producers, Saudi Arabia and Russia in particular, would scale back their production to sort of bring the supply and demand equation closer to balance or to equilibrium. Some folks are optimistic that's going to happen. Some folks aren't. This was a meeting that was supposed to take place earlier this week, and it was pushed back. I think investors are feeling optimistic. Many investors are feeling optimistic that we could see a production cut from OPEC Plus, perhaps with the participation of the United States. That meeting abuts a G20 energy meeting on Friday. Again, that'll be virtual as well. But from what I've been hearing from energy analysts is we'll see what happens out of that virtual meeting of OPEC Plus on Thursday. Then it'll be in the G20's hands. They'll have to figure out what they have to do in terms of production globally. Even if that price war that we've talked so much about between Saudi Arabia and Russia were to end, if there were to be some cessation, that's not going to solve this problem where there's just simply too much oil being produced around the world and not enough buyers and not enough places to put that oil. It's really going to take some hard cuts by a lot of producers, I think, to bring that closer to balance, Allison.
All right, David, we will look forward to both of those meetings happening in different forms than usual, Thursday and Friday. David, great to have you with us. We missed you and the books over the past couple of days. Wonderful that you were here with us today.
They're back. Nice to see you, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.